Hi, so I'm Taylor, and I want to talk a little bit today about sources and uses of funds. So I'm working on finishing up the redraft of the runway and cost budgeting tool, which is really a model to build for early stage companies looking to kind of raise capital. One of the last features I'm looking to kind of build in there to get like feature complete is an idea of the sources and uses of funds. Sources and uses of funds is an unnecessarily complex way to say where am I getting my money from externally, and then where am I going to spend it. And it's really a way to justify for an investor, hey, if you give me a certain amount of money, here's where I'm going to spend it. And it's important from a budgeting perspective, but as much a strategy perspective. Like, this is what I plan to do with it, which becomes like a really good justification and basis for conversations around the strategy of the firm. Should I hire this person? Should I invest in marketing? Should I do these sort of things? And it becomes important because it's a demonstration of like, hey, if you give me a amount of money, so I'm going to spend it. But it's also a demonstration you've really thought about what you're going to do with it. So this is like the last kind of features that I'm looking to kind of build into it. I just want to show you how I'm kind of approaching it. Now, one simple way to do this is you can start a model by building it, right? So you could just start with the sources and uses of funds. You could say, hey, I'm going to raise, say seed equity. Say I'm going to raise seed equity of 1.5. I could say it's my total sources, my total kind of uses of funds, sources of funds, I should say. And then maybe uses of funds going to be salary for one person. Maybe it's a salary for new hire. Maybe you're going to grow the team, hire a bunch of new people. Maybe you're going to get an office space. You'll probably pay benefits, but certainly payroll taxes, top of salaries. You'll probably pay, overhead for the office, and probably spend on marketing, growth, those sort of things. Total uses. So now basically our goal is to make sure that our total sources equal total uses. So I'm going to lay in a couple more inputs here. And don't pay too much attention to any of the numbers. I'm not really just trying to generate numbers at the moment, to be honest with you. And then maybe I'm just going to back into this one. So it gives me a basic idea of the basic sources and uses. And maybe it's like my first time kind of building this approach. Maybe I start off by doing this. Maybe I just build this and I can use an idea of like, here's my overall budget for my funding. You could use this to create a cost forecast on a budget going forward by saying, okay, this is the total. Well, then here's the time over which it's being spent. You could actually just build up, if you did a monthly time scale going across here, you could then allocate these costs over time, say a 12 to 18 month period, whatever you expect to cover the seed funding to cover. And then you actually build a sources and uses as well as a cost budget going forward. So that's one way to do it. In my model, I tend to not do it that way. I tend to build the actual forecast of my expenses and then back into what it means as sources and uses. So, for example, here's the forecast sheet. The forecast sheet is really the core place where I build, in this model specifically, where I build most of the forecast to it. And this is kind of a new structure that I've kind of been working on. I'm just going to put in some dummy numbers so that I can generate some stuff. So sources and uses is the last thing. So this is one way I did to kind of generate this. And usually this is one of those things that's really valuable to do in terms of like a pie chart, for example. So I may actually insert a chart here just because it's nice to see it. I can clean the chart up later. But basically a pie chart or a bar chart, for example, are really nice ways to show like an allocation of the uses of funds. So so I've added a few, just like general labels of the charts. So now it becomes, okay, cool. So I created this cost forecast. Well, now what do I do? And how do I use that cost forecast to create sources and uses? So what I'm going to do is I have these set of expenses, and the way I build these models those detailed like level by layer individual line expenses get summed into categories. So I know I have these other categories I'm going to use. And so I'm just going to say, hey, I'm going to use these categories. I don't know how it goes. So I don't care about depreciation, amortization, expenses. I don't care about interest. I'm not worried about taxes for right now. So let's just do this basically. And so now, in this seed equity right here was an input from this. What I'm going to do is on the forecast sheet, I'm going to actually pull this. I'm going to actually add this directly. It happens in the first period, and this is the structure I use for this. And so now on summary sheet, I can actually see that cash flow from financing came in for that funding round. I can see it came right here as well. A little bit off if it was between zeros in there. A little much. So now in sources and uses, instead of having these be the inputs, I got to calculate them out. Now, the next question you're probably going to ask is, okay, cool, well, how do I know how long to use it for? So there's a couple of different ways to do this. So one way I could do is I could make an assumption for like time, right? So, I can do two, this is probably the best way to do it. Month of expense cover. You make an assumption for this, and you actually sum the expenses over the time period. Month of expenses. Let's say this was to cover 18 months. And now, instead of this being the an input, I'm gonna there's a couple different ways to do this. So you do a sum if, I'm gonna do sum if. So now I'm gonna say I'm gonna sum all of my equity investments sum range, criteria range that fall under month. And now I'm going to say that it is less than now it's done, right? So sum product or sum if is like the two formulas I would use for that. I'm going to use sum product in this case, just because it's easy. The one that's messy about I'm using sum if s for this. You can use sum if. I just by default always use sum if s because a lot use it for multiple criteria level bunch. The one thing to remember with like the sum ifs is if it's for less than, you have to use this like construction kind of method where you have to kind of mix text and kind of a variable. And so this is like an input I'm assuming from 18. You could just put into an 18 for example, but I want to make this kind of variable based. This does have the assumption that it starts from month 1, right? So in another version, I would change this formula so that it basically finds the month in which it finds the month of the first fundraising or the second fundraising, whatever, finds the month of fundraising, and then does 18 months from that. That's kind of a methodology to do for it. For simplicity purposes, I'm just going to assume for month 1. So now do the exact same thing for the salaries and benefits. So I'm going to lock this. Pull that into salaries. I'm going to go to forecast and see and remind myself where what row numbers for salaries. So I'm going to go 63. So now change this to 63. Let's see if I did it right. Perfect. I think I got rid of the salaries expense. So let's add one back in. So now I'm going to see the salary expense start coming in. And so this is like a nice way to kind of create this chart. Full production use, I'll change the formula so that it's flexible based upon, the additional assumption would be the month that you month you start the sources and uses from, or basically the month that the fundraising round is raised, and then the amount of expenses of the fund going on past that. The other thing to note here is that they don't equal, right? So it's like they don't actually equal. So a couple of things we can do: we can change the time period. We can change the time period to a longer time period. If they're not equal, then you have to think about why they're not equal, right? So it forces you to think about, okay, what happens if they're not the same, right? How should I change my cost forecast to fit towards a number of months, so that my amount that I'm raising fits toward that. There's ways to change the sources of funds as well. So perhaps maybe you start earning revenues. So maybe you want to introduce revenues as a source of fund at some point, and then put the so even for this example, I have this cost of sales as a category, but I don't have the revenues in here as a sources. So I want to include that as a sources of capital. If there are any other grants or non-dilutive financing or stuff like that, would be an important part to it. But the key thing is to make sure you can get the sources of funds to equal out to the uses of funds, so that you kind of budget to kind of afford appropriately. And there's a couple of tricks sometimes you can do to have it read the amount of expenses and then have effectively like this number of months to be a variable based upon the total number of funds necessary to call for the total sources, but without worrying about that kind of complexity. I just want to focus on like a simple kind of way to structure and pull sources and uses from a budget, a set of expenses you created, and then just also show you how I'm building into my model. I can answer any questions. Happy to help.